session, and I'm honored to be here with Stephen Post. Stephen Post, PhD, has been spreading the science of giving and the commitment to the greater good for the last 20 years. He's an international speaker and has taught at the University of Chicago Case Western School of Medicine and Stony Brook University. Stephen's the best-selling author of several books, including Why Good Things Happen to Good People, Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People, and Pure Unlimited Love, Science and the Seven Paths to Inner Peace. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today for the Power of Love Summit. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am as well, Lori. Thanks for having me.
So your work is centered on this idea of pure unlimited love. So why don't we start there? And can you explain to the viewers what that means and how they can actually cultivate that in their daily lives?
What does it mean first? Well, it has a few parts to it. What is love, first of all? I think of love in terms of the well-being and the security of another being as real to me as my own, and sometimes more so. So that's a very good definition that a lot of psychiatrists have used, if I've encountered them over the years. Unlimited meaning expansive, extensive, not myopic, not focused in on just the near and dear, although it's fine to be concerned with the near and dear and loving, of course, but you've got to be leaning outwards. It's also wise, because sometimes love is unwise, unfortunately. We overindulge our kids and we teach them that they can be selfish and not worry about their impact on others. Pure, what does pure mean? Pure means that your love is not mixed with selfishness. It's not going to suddenly twist around and reverse itself in some sort of ego anger. So it's pure, and it's also enduring. So that's important, because pure unlimited love has what I call duration. It doesn't come and go, and it's always fairly radiant. So one of my doctor friends here asked me, so what is pure unlimited love? And I said, what do you think it is? He said, well, when you close your eyes for the last time in this life, hopefully it's what you see. And so it does have a spiritual dimension. And I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, if the love of the Supreme Being, for those who think there is such an entity in whatever tradition they prefer, that might be a 10. Whereas the typical human being might be on that scale maybe a 5 or a 4. A Gandhi might be a 7 or an 8 because he had such a sense of extensivity or inclusion. So you can think of yourself in those terms. No human being is perfect. We are all flawed, and we have good days and bad days, as do I. Even when I prepare early in the morning and meditate and so forth on all the major encounters I will have in the course of the day, and how can I meet this individual with the kind of love that they need, but I can still get angry and even out of sorts when somebody has the audacity to slow up in front of the yellow light on the way to school, and it just takes me another half hour to navigate the traffic. So pure unlimited love, pure, unlimited, and love.
So I'm curious, because you mentioned a spiritual dimension. So I'm curious how you see this. Like for me personally, would see that divine presence as the source of that love that flows through me and out into the world. Is that how you see it, or do you see it differently?
No, I do see it that way. In fact, the great philanthropist John Templeton once faxed me from Nassau, and he said, Stephen, we need to start an institute to study the greatest human asset, unlimited love, because he used that word too. And I faxed back, Sir John, that is not the kind of language that my colleagues in this medical school, I was at Case Western at the time, readily accept. Mm-hmm. Maybe we could make it creative altruism, the Institute for Creative Altruism, because altruism is a nice, dry, sciencey word. And he faxed back, no, Stephen, I think unlimited love, pure unlimited love, up to $8.9 million. And I faxed back, Sir John, I just love that language. It jumps right off the page. And he was so right, because, honestly, Lori, it gets right to your comment that it invites involvement from all of the great spiritual traditions. And I certainly, I'm Hindu enough and Buddhist enough, I suppose, to think that there is a supreme being, a kind of love energy that precedes everything else in the universe. The Hindus and the Upanishads speak about that supreme energy as being pure love, as being free and creative. So those are the three aspects of our own personalities which are essential to our being, if you will, in the image of the divine. And it does come through us. You have to sometimes work with it. You have to meditate, you have to pray, you have to breathe right, you have to make space in your life for this to manifest so it doesn't just happen automatically, and virtues can help. But for sure, it's a process, and it sometimes feels like an invasion.
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree that it's participatory for sure. Yes. That we can't just be a bystander and just think that, we're going to become enlightened or self-realized or, experience that kind of love. Can you talk a little bit about the transformative power of love? Because you mentioned Gandhi, and when I think of Gandhi, I think of Martin Luther King Jr., who went and spent a good deal of time with Gandhi.
That's right.
And so they really understood the power of love to transform society, transform our culture, and consequently, they both kind of perished.
Yes.
And so, yeah, can you talk about like what is it that they knew and that they were trying to do, and that you're trying to do with this, bringing this pure love to the world?
Well, pure unlimited love can be manifested or expressed in many different ways. So for some people in our medical center here, it's expressed as attentive listening to a patient who is ill and really needs to be affirmed. Sometimes it can be expressed as compassion when they are suffering greatly and need to know that you're really wanting to be there to relieve that suffering. It can be expressed in many, many ways. Some people are called to express love through creativity. I think Chagall would be a great example of that with his Blue Angel drawings and paintings and stained glass windows. So people are called to express love in different ways. I think that Gandhi and King were called to express love really in the context of social activism. They were working against certain political divides, prejudices, and that can be dangerous. Now, Mother Teresa in Calcutta, she was taking care of wonderful young kids who needed help, and everybody adored her. She got great praise, and she was the first winner of the Templeton Prize, I might add. But on the other hand, people like Martin Luther King were killed. And King was killed by an obviously prejudiced, racist individual who hated the idea of racial equality. So when you're called into the domain of love as an activity that really requires you to stand up in courage, both courage and also wisdom. And I don't want to pretend that Martin Luther King was self-immolating, that he wanted to do something that would be harmful to himself. He said never that. He always wanted to, and he had a robust sense of humor. He always wanted to live and live long and live well. But he also said, and I'm quoting here, that in his particular calling of love, that danger comes with the territory. And it did. Doesn't happen that way for everybody, but Mrs. Butoh, Abraham Lincoln would be an excellent example. There are so many individuals who are, in fact, in harm's way because what they're doing is really bucking the system.
Can you comment on like what's happening currently? Because I know that part of your mission is to help people feel that sense of inner peace, even in times of chaos. And so this is a seemingly chaotic time, although I think that there's, I think there's a reason that there is a scriptural reference to this as the world of appearances. But
Yes.
So in this world of appearances, things seem to be chaotic right now. And if somebody is called to express their love through activism, what would you say to them in this time?
Well, I would say be prudent, but be courageous. I go visit the emergency room on the weekends, the psychiatric emergency room, and I see what's going on. I have many students who are doing psychiatry at Mount Sinai and NYU and other places in New York City. And I speak with them quite frequently, and they are astonished at the amount of anxiety that is out there in our culture. It's as though the center is not holding, to quote T.S. Eliot. And when that happens, it affects people's mindset, their consciousness, their emotions. And it's very disturbing for so many individuals. I think that at the same time, this is the beginning of an age of pure unlimited love. I think there are so many sprouts, so many Mayflowers about to come out through the snow. And I'm impressed by everything that's going on around the world. I think it's a tremendously creative time. So I'm ultimately quite optimistic, very optimistic, in fact. And I think that, this is really like in Buddhism, the lotus being the symbol of divine love. There's a book by one great Buddhist writer, now deceased, Thich Nhat Hanh, called No Mud, No Lotus. Do you know that one?
Yes, I do. Yeah, they only grow in the mud. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way it works. If you think about love, that is the blossoming of the lotus, and the lotus is pure. It's pure white. It is resilient. That's the other feature of the lotus, it just springs up from the muddied waters. And so we have to cherish these times. And I do. I love living in these times because I think they're very difficult for a lot of people. And, I see an awful lot of clinical activity, and I realize the depth of people's suffering. But it's also a wonderful opportunity. And by the way, just on love, okay, so I like to distinguish kindness, which is just opening the door for somebody. It's telling a little dad joke on the escalator. What did the fish say when it swam into the wall? Damn. And everybody starts laughing because mirth is one of my expressions of love, and it's very important, and I cultivate it, but always tasteful and uplifting and almost embarrassing at times. But I think that there's also empathy, which is that capacity to connect emotionally in presence with the state of another. And then, in a more narrow sense, compassion is that emotional empathy in the context of another person's suffering. And it includes a willingness or a readiness to alleviate that suffering. And so those are all important features of love, but love is expressed in loyalty. I've been married 43 years. Can you imagine that?
Congratulations.
I guess so. I have a wonderful wife. She's from Kyoto, and she's very Buddhist and very wonderful. And I've been really fortunate and blessed. I have wonderful kids. And, I think that creativity for me is one major expression of love. Like Chagall, Chagall had a Blue Angel dream. Talk about the spiritual side of this. He ran away from home when he was 18. His father was very angry at him because he didn't want to join the pickling factory. The family pickled fish. And so Chagall didn't think that was his destiny or his calling. So he goes to St. Petersburg, and he has no money at all. He hasn't done any significant artwork yet, but he starts sketching, and he's pretty good at it. So one evening, he's in an alleyway, and he's sleeping on a mattress with this huge guy who was a laboring worker. His eyes are closed. He's facing the wall, and he sees a wonderful blue angel descending upon him. He describes this in his wonderful book, My Life, which he wrote about 10 years later. And he felt complete peace. He felt that that was a gift of inner peace. It was irresistible. It was surprising. And there it was. And the rest of his life, what did he paint? Blue angels. If you go to the Art Institute in Chicago, Blue Angels. If you go to the UN, Blue Angels. If you go to Peconico Hills, the Blue Angels and the Good Samaritan. If you look at what he was painting the day he died in Paris in his studio, he was painting Blue Angels because he thought blue was the color of love. So back to your earlier point, I don't think he felt that came from him alone. I think he felt that his vision of the Blue Angel was a gift. And that was his mission, his calling in life. And he did a beautiful job. My mom loved Chagall, and she took me into the UN when the Chagall windows were unveiled. And I never shook his hand, but I saw him there. And he was a very mystical guy. And he believed in all the great symbols of all the great religions. And it was confusing for a lot of his viewers because they wanted him to be more purely one or the other, but not for him. He was very eclectic. And I think we need to overcome the divisions of our time by becoming a little more mutually appreciative, a little more eclectic, and really embrace the ultimate reality of all existence, which is behind all spirituality, and that is pure, unlimited love.
Yeah, sometimes I call it life with a capital L.
Okay.
Or unconditional love. But yes, that quality, there's that quality that it does permeate everything. And I share your optimism, actually, by the way. And I feel like we're in a time where people are starting to understand that the things that unfold in their life are actually happening for them and not to them. And that this crucible of life is actually designed to sort of pull these qualities out of us, so some of which I would consider divine qualities. But
Yes.
I want to pick up on this idea of following your calling, because I know you outlined 7 major paths to inner peace.
Yes.
And that are all related to love, and following your calling, I believe, is one of them. So can you walk the viewers through what the seven are and how they can help people find that sense of inner peace.
Sure, I'd love to do that. The first one is May You Give and Glow. So my institute has been funding research in this area for now 25 years, from 2000. And, this is about the scientific study of how people feel. It's not just giving, it's kind giving. Because it's that inner quality. People give for all kinds of reasons, but it's that quality of kindness that I think is not properly emphasized in the scientific literature. And I wrote a book called Why Good Things Happen to Good People about this. I've written dozens and dozens of papers in medical journals and helped create what's called social prescribing, which is a big movement now where in clinical settings, people are encouraged to involve themselves in volunteering, and that's facilitated by individuals who are actually hired in the clinics. This is a big deal in 30 different countries, including the National Health Service in England. So for me, Give and Glow is a big deal, and I've written about this in every context of illness, but beyond that, just in general life, people talk about the helper's high. That's been a language game that's been around since about 1992. I did not create that. It was created by a wonderful guy in Brooklyn who would send people out to just randomly be involved in helping others. And he'd survey them and ask them how they felt later in the day. They went out for 2 hours at a time, and they all said they felt elated. They felt better. So we did a study with United Healthcare. This was in early 2010. We had asked people, did you volunteer in 2009? So how many volunteered? 42% of American adults volunteered. And amazingly, 98% said it made them feel emotionally elated. They said that it made them better able to overcome loss and disappointment. They said wonderful things about how that manifested emotionally in their lives. So we wrote a paper about how people who are recently divorced or had lost a spouse deal with the kind of anxiety and emotional challenges of that adjustment, mainly focused on widows and widowers. So I got a call from the New York Society of Widows and Widowers to go into New York and give a talk. I gave a talk about this. It was a big hotel. There were probably 600 or 700 people there. And I told them that, you're going to feel more peaceful. You're going to feel more meaning in your life. You don't have to worry about tit for tat, about reciprocity. You don't have to even put that in your mind. It's not a kind of economic transaction. You can just put that on the shelf and just feel all the good qualities that you'll experience. And this guy in the back of the room, he started frantically raising his hands, and he said, I don't care what you say, buddy. I don't do nothing for nothing. And, New York's a nice place. So I kind of felt like maybe I wasn't in Cleveland anymore. I won't go there. But anyway, but that is a very important piece of it, and it can be very healing, and it's very effective. But
before you go on to the next one, I just want to comment.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it was Gandhi, but somebody said, if you want to find yourself, lose yourself in service to others.
Yes.
It might have been Gandhi. I'm not sure. But what I wanted to comment on is I just love this. We've been so secularized in the West, and I'm loving witnessing how science is actually an avenue that's kind of bringing us full circle back into our spiritual nature. I love that. So,
yeah, that's true. And the whole movement of science and spirituality. Remember, by the way, spirituality and religion are different. Spirituality is the pure, unlimited love of the divine, of neighbor, of self, and of nature. You know, when you go off to meditate in some little Stony Brook area, they'll always have wind chimes and a little stream of water flowing, because there's something about nature, being immersed in nature, that frees you from a lot of the concerns and anxieties of everyday life. Mm-hmm. So I think that those four loves, love of the divine, the love of neighbor, the love of self, and the love of nature, are all equally important. I'm a big believer in that. So in Pure Unlimited Love, the sixth chapter is entitled, May You Cherish the Gift of Nature. Mm. It is a gift. So the second one is May You Heal with Kindness, which I think is pretty self-evident. And I actually talk a lot about how kindness works in general in life, and is a healing power, but we sometimes forget about it in the highly technological, brave new world that we're sometimes caught up in. So that's what we do. This is a Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics in the medical school. That's where I'm speaking from. We train everybody in compassionate care and empathy, because we know how healing that could be. And it involves tone of voice. We teach courses on toolkits for compassion. And we do the science. You know, we bring in the neuroscience, we bring in all the social science, and we create spaces in the environment. We have a program called Stop, Look, Listen. So whenever you go into a new patient's room, you stop, you breathe, you enter the room, you look carefully, you observe, you have to notice people, and then you listen attentively. And then afterwards, at the end of the day, you reflect back with your peers about what you saw and what you heard. So, may you heal with love. May you give and glow. May you heal with love. May you follow your callings. So, you know, if you have any kids, you know, sometimes they can really struggle to find their callings. I think I struggled to find my callings when I was young, and I suppose that's our goal. What is a calling? I believe that every human being, without any exception, has a certain set of talents and gifts that are given to them by destiny, by nature, by the divine. And their calling in life is to utilize those gifts to the benefit of others, which also rebounds to the benefit of self. But William Shakespeare and Picasso both refer to this as the purpose of life. I don't want to be too simplistic, but using your gifts for the service of others is, in fact, the way that we find ourselves. How do you actually find your calling? Well, I'm a big advocate for volunteering. I've written a lot of books about volunteering. People come into the hospital here and they try all different kinds of things because they want to get a feel for what's involved. And sometimes it takes trial and error. But then when you find your calling, or what you feel is your calling, at least for the near future, you don't want to give up on it. So you never want to be seduced by a little more money, a little more prestigious institution. You want to stay with it. And that is really important. So that's number 3.
Do you think people can have different callings? Like the same person have different callings at different periods in their life?
Oh, I do. And I think people oftentimes have several callings simultaneously. You may be called to be a good spouse. You may be called to be a good parent. You may be called to be a good softball coach. And you may be called to work in a healthcare center and teach compassion. So you can have callings simultaneously. And sometimes they will fade a little bit. But that can mean 2 things. It can mean you need to just go a little further and find a slightly different calling. But it can also mean that you have to stick with it and recognize that oftentimes, we all live in the mud. That's the lotus image. And you have to anticipate that there will be periods when you're not as animated or convinced as you once were. And you will ask questions of self-doubt. Maybe I did the wrong thing 20 years ago. Maybe I married the wrong person. Who knows? Cicely Saunders was a good friend of mine. She founded the hospice movement. And she said, when you're talking to someone who's dying, you always want to ask them, what was their calling in life? What did they find was most fulfilling? Because what she worried about was here they are near death, and they're second guessing themselves, and they're thinking, I could have done that, or I could have done this. And she thought that was a very unpleasant state of mind. So she wanted them to feel that their lives were meaningful, and she focused their attention on their callings. And callings are actions of love.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And that's actually part of, I would say that's one of my callings is doing Reiki, doing energy work with people who are in that moment of a transition.
Yes. You want them? I'll do the other ones real quick.
Yeah, let's do all 7.
Yeah. So number 4, may you raise kind children. I have an institute funded by Sir John Templeton, the Institute for Research on Pure Unlimited Love, and you can Google that. And we've been funding research on how to raise kind children for many years, and some of it's gotten a lot of play in the culture and also internationally. Tom Lacona, for example, How to Raise Kind Kids. And there are a lot of things that you can learn about it. When we bring children into the world, what's our goal with them? I think we want them to be kind. If you're a parent and your child is wantonly unkind, it's not a good feeling. So you want your kids to be kind. And how do you teach them that? I'm not going to go into the details, but the book, Pure Unlimited Love, has a wonderful chapter about the how-tos, toolkit for raising kind children. And then the 5th one is, may you know inner peace. May you know the one mind. That's about prayer and meditation, and each morning, as I do, when you get up, spend a half an hour just focusing your mind on the energy of love, breathe deeply, and envision all the major encounters you will have over the course of the day. So I always know that. I keep a big book full of my appointments. I don't keep it all on a little computer somewhere. And I know people, and I ask myself, so what expression of love do they need? Maybe someone needs forgiveness because they feel like they've done something wrong. Maybe they've lost a patient because of some sort of error that they've made. And I have to say to them, quoting Martin Luther King, those who make no mistakes make nothing. That's a great quote. Saved a few careers that way. Maybe there's someone who needs compassion because they've been de-dignified. Someone told them in humiliating them that they had no gifts, they had no talents, they're no good for anything. And my job, when I imagine that encounter, is to ask myself, how can I build that person up? And so there's someone might need an expression of loyalty. You could say to them, however your life is going, I'll always be here. My door is open. And actually that works well in a medical school like this. Medical students just come into my office left and right without an appointment. And it's very powerful, and it sort of makes our program successful. I mean, we have more students studying empathy and compassionate care than students studying many other topics, including public health and the hard sciences. So if you do it right, if you have a quality of mirth, if you're not overbearing, and if you let people understand how important this is, not just to their patients, but to themselves and their own well-being and their own happiness long term. It prevents burnout. Lots of studies that we've done showing that medical students who are identified by their peers as empathic have longer careers. They go into residencies and they're happier and they're more likely to succeed. So, simple point here is that you want to have that inner quality, and you have to cultivate it purposefully. That's where spirituality does come in. And then sixth is, may you cherish the gift of nature. Doesn't mean worship nature, but it means see nature as a gift. I worry, I get out on Route 80, which goes from the George Washington Bridge to San Francisco. And, I used to drive back and forth quite a bit when I was younger. And I always was amazed at the majestic mountains at the Delaware Water Gap, Mount Tammany. And I would get out and walk on the Appalachian Trail. And I went to Reed College, and Steve Jobs slept on my floor, by the way, and we read the autobiography of a yogi. Just FYI, in passing. And that's why I was going back and forth so much in those days. I didn't like to fly much, so I had an old Nissan Sentra that did pretty well on that old highway. But you've got to love nature and see nature as an expression of the divine, and all these wonderful books coming out about awe and wonder as very powerful, fundamental emotions. And so much of spirituality is about awe. It's about, wow, look at the beauty of this or that. I ride the ferry from Port Jefferson, New York, over to Bridgeport at least every 2 weeks, because I just need to get out on the water and, feel the waves and see the beauty of it all, and not just be stuck in a brutalist building. And then the final one is, may you honor the spirit of freedom. So I don't see freedom as purely materialistic. I don't think it's in the Western sense, it's like a dog wanting to bite through a chain or a leash. Well, it'll try to do that unless you keep it well fed. So as Dostoevsky pointed out, people prefer security to freedom. That's why I think that freedom ultimately is part of the divine nature within us. As I said earlier, in Hinduism, the three qualities of the supreme are love, creativity, and freedom. And so we have a duty, we have an obligation to be free. And even if it's more comfortable not to be free, we shouldn't be seduced by that. So those are the 7 paths to inner peace, and they're all well studied and have lots of interesting examples in them and how to. And so I'm hopeful that this will be a successful book for people who really are looking for something more than happiness. I'm not a big believer in all this happiness literature. I mean, what is happiness?
Yeah. It's the last one you spoke of, the freedom. It's, again, like being in the secularized society. I think a lot of people think of freedom without that spiritual component, and they think of it as license. Like, yes, license to do whatever I want to do without anybody, right, stopping or interfering. And in some ways, that seems like it's almost the opposite of pure unlimited love. We're not taking anybody else into consideration. So
totally the case. And the great Hindu scriptures talk about this nature of the divine wanting to express itself in us as human beings. And so therefore we are each endowed with a small drop of this great one mind, this great universal mind. And the thing that the divine is looking for relationally is for us to be free, creative, and loving. And I do believe that. So I'm a fairly free guy in lots of different ways, but I'm always thinking about my callings and the ways I can use freedom to benefit the people around me.
So one of your callings has been to work with deeply forgetful people, and I want to give you a chance to talk about that because the time is going by so quickly. But can you just share a little bit about maybe how we can better support our loved ones who are going through dementia, Alzheimer's, memory issues?
Yeah. So, dementia is a syndrome that can be caused by many diseases: Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, stroke events. There are many different causes. 100 years ago, neurosyphilis was the major cause of dementia. People weren't living so long. They didn't have antibiotics. So dementia is a very broad category. But my grandmother, Post, died of what was probably Alzheimer's disease. They called it senile dementia at the time. And I used to come by the nursing home as a kid and visit with her and do assisted oral feeding. She sometimes couldn't remember my name, but I didn't give a hoot about that because I felt somewhat mystically that she was still there. So I don't even like the word dementia because it's a word, it's similar to the word retard, right? We don't call people retarded. We call them differently abled, or we have different language games for that now. Dementia, a decline from a former mental state. Look, the artist Wilhelm de Kooning was diagnosed with dementia, and he died 14 years after the diagnosis. He was an abstract expressionist, a great artist. For 13 and a half years, he painted. He was in a studio in Greenwich Village with one assistant, and he would just sporadically rise up, dip his brush in acrylic, and go up to the easel, and he would paint. And I think he became liberated when he had dementia, because he was always known as a tough guy. He was getting in fist fights in front of the Café Wa and all that sort of stuff. And he was the perfect image of the age of anxiety and even approximately violence in times. But when he became deeply forgetful, and that's my expression, which I much prefer to demented. I mean, and it's catching on. I mean, half the people in America now are using the term deeply forgetful people by our Gallup poll. And I wrote a book with Hopkins called Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People, how caregivers can meet the needs of their loved ones. But this is very important stuff because there's a lot of dementia around. And, we don't want to do what the Nazis did, which was to have a program like T4 where they would take people with memory disorders and out of the asylums and experiment with them on hypothermia. So that they would super cool them in ice water or out on the snow. 70,000 of them for a year and a half. And these were not the discriminate against groups. These were not people of color or Jewish descent or people who were gay and things like that, which is what the Nazis did, unfortunately. But these were, shall we say, blue-eyed Aryans of the right lineage. And the German people themselves, to their slight credit, they reacted against the T4 program, Tiergarstrasse 4, 4th Street in Munich. And it was stopped. But the very same investigators who were in charge of T4 went to the death camps of Dachau and Auschwitz, and they inflicted hypothermia experimentation on the Jews. So, this is a very sad moment in history, and it's so easy to think about, even clinically, people think about people who are deeply forgetful as somehow less than human. They're shells, they're husks, they're dead, they're gone. You hear all these negative metaphors, which just flow naturally from the word dementia. So what I've done over the years is insist on changing the language game. And, I'm a little deeply forgetful too. I don't know how you are. But I was out in the parking lot here behind the medical school one day. And honestly, I could not remember where I parked my car. That's okay. They say it's okay to forget where you parked your car. It's not so good if you forget that you have a car that's parked. So I had to ask a medical student if she knew if I drove to work this morning. Obviously, she didn't know, but she laughed. She thought it was absolutely hilarious. So you've got to be inclusive, and the kinds of things that are going on now, music and memory, personalized music, art. We had a guy who would come into an art therapy class in the mornings, and he would, with a black crayon, he would sketch things out fairly chaotically on a pad of paper. But every time he drew the same two lines down the middle. And we would ask him, so, Luke, what's that line? He couldn't respond. He was not communicative. But then one morning he just blurted out, it's a map for my daughter to find her way to my house. So a lot of times there's more meaning there. And I've written a lot about how to speak with people who are deeply forgetful. Don't ever ask them, what would you like for breakfast? Because then you're putting them on the spot. They're under pressure. They have to come up with the language. But if you say, would you like toasties or ham and eggs? You're using your language to cue them.
Yeah.
And they can respond. They can respond. And so there is a lot to learn about how to connect with these people. They're always creative. I mean, they do amazing things creatively, and they can connect with dogs. And one of the things I did in Scotland some years ago was begin the Alzheimer's dogs movement. And, they love to have a dog around. A cuddly dog makes a big difference. Not a big one, not one that's unmanageable, but a small-sized a Labrador is awfully good. And I was in Sydney doing a talk about the Alzheimer's dogs movement. And there were about 200 people there who actually were affected by dementia. And they all had their dogs, and the dogs were wearing all these crazy vests and things. And we went out for a walk as a whole line of people down, and with their caregivers, down the main drag of Sydney. And a taxi driver pulled up and he said, "Blimey, what's this? Dogs are for blind people." So I want to start and continue to develop a dogs movement for the deeply forgetful. But that's a calling of mine. It comes from my grandmother, and she was a great woman.
Yeah, you used the word liberated when you were speaking earlier about the artist, and I thought that was a really interesting word to use. And from a spiritual perspective, from a metaphysical perspective, I have heard in the past that, that this process of Alzheimer's or becoming deeply forgetful is sometimes a blessing for people who have been tightly controlled and or controlling. And, we also, because we're looking from the outside in, so we don't actually know what's happening in there. I'm curious if you have heard of this. Oh my goodness, her name is escaping me. She's a Harvard doctor who has published something called the telepathy tapes, working with autistic kids.
Oh, the autistics,
who are nonverbal, and finding, that this telepathic relationship with parents and caregivers, and that when they're given some new tool to be able to communicate, that they're, at savant level, at genius level with some of these things. And so I'm curious, just to kind of tie that in with how it may be similar, because it's we don't know what's going on because there's a loss of that ability to communicate. Like you're saying, don't just ask an open-ended question, because that's creating that difficulty of them trying to find the words to communicate.
Right. So terrific points, and I will respond to both of them together. With regard to the deeply forgetful, people are held hostage to these negative myths. Like I said earlier, I don't do nothing for nothing. Life is purely transactional. We've heard that before. And it's not, of course. At certain points, it can be transactional, but in general, it's not transactional. It's about love. So for sure, people I've known with deep forgetfulness have been liberated in terms of their kindness and their altruism. I knew one guy in Cleveland who had a dastardly reputation, and all his family identified him in focus groups as not being very generous or kind. But suddenly he insisted on riding, if you will, in the passenger seat in the van, go around Shaker Heights, Ohio, and bring people into the Foley Elder Healthcare Center for these art programs. And he was so joyful. It's like he had been totally freed from these cultural assumptions that, the one thing you can't be in life is a sucker. And so I like that. And as far as the autistic community goes, so I knew when I was at the University of Chicago, I knew Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book Flow, very interesting psychologist. And he defined the flow state as a state where people are kind of beyond much of a sense of time and place. They're so totally immersed creatively in what they're doing. And, maybe Michael Jordan shooting threes, maybe Virginia Woolf writing through her depression. I guess we all hopefully get in the flow state. It's one of the areas where Marty Seligman says we find the most happiness. There's hedonic happiness, there's flow happiness, and there's happiness that he calls eudaimonia, that sense, if you look back, that my life was well lived and meaningful. But people with autism, what do we know about their consciousness? Very little. So they may be what they call stemming. They may be repeating an activity, and it's frightening to the parents because, look, you want your kid to be mainstreamed, you want them to be behaving normally and so forth. But the bottom line is that they may be quite happy. And when you pull them out of that stemming state, they become angry about it, almost universally. And so I'm very open-minded. I don't know what's going on with them emotionally in those conditions of repetitive action, but it might not be the worst thing in the world. I wrote a paper about this with a bunch of people, about 10 co-authors, which was very well received in one of the Yale journals on autism and child development. And we all felt that there was happiness, overlooked happiness, in people with autism, and we should understand them better.
In my own direct experience, I've had what I would call like a multidimensional experience. And so I think as we continue to do research on consciousness, that we might find that, again, whether it's deeply forgetful or autistic, where we're looking from the outside in, that we might find that there's far more happening than
Absolutely.
we would currently realize. I also wanted to comment too, because, when you were talking about the dogs, music, sound healing, art, it seems like the things that help the most are not left brain things. These all seem to be right brain, creative, more gestalt activities. Can you just comment on that?
I will. So the greatest neurologist of the 20th century was my mentor at Case Western, Joseph Michael Foley. And he was the head of all of the committees for the NIH that developed the differential diagnosis for many of the neurodegenerative illnesses that result ultimately in dementia. And we had a big conference once at the Cleveland Clinic, and we were talking about how many of these drugs are not all that helpful. And so respectfully, I don't want to be influential on people, but maybe you get a little more word finding capacity or maybe a little more attentiveness to tasks very early in the progression of dementia, but that all then evaporates as it continues on. On a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is a really effective drug, like say insulin for diabetes is a pretty good drug. What we have for many of these neurological conditions is maybe a 1 or a 2 at best. But then getting to your point, music and memory, we have in New York, we have the Alzheimer's Choir, the Unforgettables. And these are caregivers and people affected by dementia, and they come together and they sing familiar music from their tradition. And every once in a while, they have a concert on Fifth Avenue at one of the churches there. And it's beautiful. And they all sort of come out of themselves and they connect. It's so beautiful. And one of my friends, David Keck, his mom, Janet Keck, had Alzheimer's disease. And she was at Yale Divinity School. Her husband, Leander, was a New Testament scholar. And she was out of it, shall we say. But when she went to that Yale Divinity School chapel service on Sundays, and she saw the light coming through the window, she was singing hymns that she remembered from her childhood. She was reciting prayers that meant so much to her as she was growing up. She came back, and people were surprised. And even for a few minutes after the service was over, she could actually respond to their questions about her life. And I got to say one more thing, that with Alzheimer's disease, it affects especially short-term memory. So one of my Cleveland friends is a physician. She's a wonderful woman. She helped many, many people. She got to a point where she could no longer go shopping because she couldn't remember what she wanted to shop for. Even if she wrote down things on a note paper, she'd forget why she did that and couldn't make any sense of it. But she knew all the details of certain encounters and certain things she had done earlier in life. So that essential self is oftentimes there, even though it's obscured, it's opaque. But if you give people an opportunity and you stimulate them rightly, they can come back into themselves. And we did a Gallup, first national Gallup study of caregivers across America. This article came out in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease a year ago. And what we found is that 44% of caregivers will tell you that they have experienced unexpected lucidity. That's our language game for it. Unexpected lucidity. Even their loved ones who are extraordinarily, quote unquote, lost, demented. So that means half those. And what do they feel about it? When they witness those experiences, they find hope, they find meaning in their caregiving, which is sometimes a very arduous task. And in general, there's a slightly higher depression rate in caregivers when compared to the general population, because they're under 24/7 pressure. But, when they have these episodes of lucidity, they say to themselves, and we wrote all this up, what I'm doing is not meaningless. My loved one is still there. Grandma's still there, this is what I used to say to grandkids. And that's the truth. So you never know, and it's totally arrogant for us to say that we can write off the experience and the emotions and the spirituality of someone who's autistic or who's struggling with deep forgetfulness. You can't do that. There's no basis for it.
Thank you for that. I'm really kind of taking that to heart. I have really enjoyed our conversation, and we're coming to the end of our time together. And I want to just give you a chance to say, if you had one piece of advice as far as where to start for people who are watching this and they're like, I want to live a love-centered life. What would you tell them?
Notice. I'm a big believer in synchronicity. And for me, that was the beginning of my spirituality as a young kid up in New Hampshire in high school. I realized that there were certain kinds of encounters. There were people I ran into as if in perfect answer to a prayer. They were just the right people at the right time. In Judaism, they call this, it's not l'chaim, it's something similar to that. But just too perfect to be by chance. And so you begin to think that somehow or another, if we notice it, acknowledge it, there is this kind of cherishing force in the universe. I got to tell you one last story. I went to Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And one late January, I was in the coffee shop. And a guy named Andy comes barreling through the door. It's 9 o'clock West Coast time. And he says, my name's Andy, and I've got a brand new Harley Davidson Shovelhead. It's the fastest motorcycle on earth. Who wants to go for a ride? And I, because I was not cognitively developed, I said, me, I'll go. So I went rushing out. And it was kind of slushy. It doesn't snow there, but it got wet and slushy. And I jumped on his bike, and he took off. And he really looked lit up. I mean, and I was so regretful of what I did, because he hit 180 miles an hour going through Portland, going through every red light, every stop sign, took a left on the Pacific Coast Highway. And I was crying. I thought I was dead. He was screaming into the rain as was pelting his face. And then he did a crazy Evel Knievel U-turn over the Midway, and he goes barreling back toward Portland, and he drops me off exactly where he picked me up. And I staggered across the bridge to Ackerman Dormitory, where I was living at the time. As I crossed the threshold, something strange happened. The phone rang. They had payphones back then. I remember that. And I never answered the phone, but I'd given my mother the number. So now it's about 11 o'clock in Oregon. It's about 2 in the morning in New York. And my mom has called me, and I pick up the phone. I felt a nudge. I didn't see anything, but I felt an energy sort of pushing me, which I never did, to answer the phone. I said, hello, and it was my mom, and she said, Stevie, thank God you're alive. I thought you were dead. And she talked about this premonition she'd had and how she was sweating and nervous and anxious. And I said, Mom, it's amazing that you picked that up, because I thought I was dead. And it's incredible. If you look at the literature, the guy who discovered brain waves, Berger, the so-called Berger waves, his daughter had a premonition when his son was thrown from a horse and killed miles and miles away. And so what we call Berger waves or alpha waves were discovered in that kind of mix. So we're talking about non-local mind. My mom was 3,000 miles away, and she didn't know what I was doing out there. But lo and behold, she got it. And that's the mystery of the mind. And we have that to enjoy. And that mind, it's most operative under the circumstances of pure love. Pure unlimited love allows us to connect through these amazing experiences of the non-local mind.
Wow, I feel like we could talk for another hour about that. I particularly like Larry Dossey's book, Reinventing Medicine, because he does such a great job sort of bringing all of that research together and putting it in plain language for people to understand non-locality. So I actually use that when I teach my level 2 Reiki classes for people to understand how distance healing works.
Yeah. So Larry's a very old friend, and his book One Mind is a classic.
Yeah.
And he quotes spiritual leaders, but also scientific physicists, like, many of them, who say there's only one mind. The idea that there are many minds, that the mind. So when I was at the University of Chicago, I studied with Sir John Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize. And Eccles was a neurophysiologist. He discovered everything we know, basically, about the synaptic connections in the brain. And he would say to me, but don't let anybody tell you that mind is just epiphenomenal. It's just derived from matter, from cells, from tissue. He said, no way. You cannot get mind from matter. You can't get blood from a stone. And so there's something going on there that's very profound. And that's part of the gift that we are given as human creatures. It's actually, what is the divine within us, that image of God? It's having that mind, that non-locality that we can find so meaningful. And that's where I'm always reassured to this very day that if you want to use the word God, God is pure unlimited love. And I think that is very active in my life. And I'm always trying to notice some of the kind of uncanny, connections that come around. And it makes me think thoughts of gratitude.
So as we close, I know that people are going to want to know more and they're going to want to know how they can get the book, Pure Unlimited Love. So can you tell people how they can find out more about your work?
Yeah, sure. Well, I did a book called God and Love on Route 80 once upon a time, about 4 or 5 years ago, which is really about synchronicity and these kinds of deeply metaphysical themes. But I've also done a book with Johns Hopkins Press called Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People. And that's done really well. It's had a lot of influence. And that's maybe from a health point of view, medical point of view, caregiving point of view, that's probably my most important work to date. I also did a book in 2007 called Why Good Things Happen to Good People, How to Live a Happier, Healthier, Longer Life Through the Simple Act of Giving. And this book, which I really feel is going to be the best, Pure Unlimited Love, Science and the Seven Paths to Inner Peace. That should be out in the summer. And you can pre-order it. Please do. And I'd be happy to Zoom in and talk with you about it. I'm at Stony Brook University, but I also have at www.unlimitedloveinstitute.org, my institute, which is still going strong, and then stephengpost.com is my own website.
Thank you so much. It's really been a delight to talk to you today, and thank you for following your callings